At 06:15 on July 30th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth crawled into the tail position of B-17 Tondelayo at RAF Kimballton, watching a grey English dawn that would carry him 500 miles into Germany. 24 years old, 12 combat missions, 3 confirmed kills. The Luftwaffe had positioned over 300 fighters along the route to Kassel. Arooth settled onto the bicycle seat that served as his workstation. The tail gunner position measured 4 feet wide and 5 feet long. 2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns pointed backward through a plexiglass window. At 25,000 feet, the temperature outside would drop to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. His electrically heated suit was the only thing between survival and death by hypothermia. The 8th Air Force called it the loneliest job in the war. The tail gunner worked alone, separated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. No one to talk to, no one to help if something went wrong. Just a man, 2 guns, and whatever the Luftwaffe sent his way. The statistics told the story. In the summer of 1943, the average B-17 crew survived 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners died faster than anyone except ball turret gunners. German fighter pilots preferred attacking from the rear. The tail position absorbed the first bullets. By July, the 379th Bombardment Group had already lost 9 aircraft in just 2 months of operations. 90 men gone. The problem was geometry. German pilots understood that approaching from behind gave them the longest possible firing window. A Messerschmitt Bf 109, closing at 350 miles per hour from the 6 o'clock position, had nearly 10 seconds to aim and fire before passing the bomber. The tail gunner had those same 10 seconds to hit a target moving at combined speeds, approaching 600 miles per hour. Most tail gunners never got the chance. The Focke-Wulf 190 carried 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. A single burst could shred the plexiglass bubble, kill the gunner, and disable the tail controls. Bombers without tail protection became easy targets. The fighters would circle back, line up, and finish the job. The standard Army Air Force gunnery training taught gunners to wait, conserve ammunition, fire only at ranges under 300 yards. The theory made sense in a classroom. In combat, 300 yards meant the enemy was already shooting. By the time a tail gunner opened fire, he might already be dead. Arooth had watched it happen. On his 6th mission, a B-17 flying off Tondelayo's right wing took a direct hit to the tail section. The gunner never fired a shot. The fighter came in fast, guns blazing, and the first rounds punched through the plexiglass before the American could react. The bomber fell out of formation, trailing smoke. 8 parachutes emerged. The tail gunner was not among them. The official doctrine demanded patience. Arooth questioned everything about it. The fighters attacked from maximum range because they knew American gunners would hold fire. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned the patterns. They exploited the training manual like a road map. If you want to see how Arooth challenged the doctrine that was getting tail gunners killed, please hit that like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Arooth. 186 17 seconds lifted off from bases across eastern England that morning. 123 P-47 Thunderbolts would escort them part way, but fuel limitations meant the fighters would turn back over Belgium. The bombers would fly the final 200 miles to Kassel alone. Arooth checked his ammunition belts, 400 rounds per gun, 800 total. The manual said that was enough for a standard mission. Arooth had already decided the manual was wrong about everything else. By noon, He would find out if he was right. The cost of being wrong was a closed casket funeral and a telegram to his family. The formation crossed the English Channel at 14,000 feet. Still climbing, Arooth watched the water recede through his plexiglass window, the white cliffs of Dover shrinking to a pale line on the horizon. Ahead lay occupied France, then Belgium, then the heart of Nazi Germany. The P-47 escorts held position around the bomber stream. Their presence meant safety, but Arooth knew the arithmetic. The Thunderbolts carried enough fuel for roughly 90 minutes of combat flying. The mission to Kassel would take 6 hours. For most of the journey, the bombers would fly alone. Arooth had spent his first missions following doctrine. Wait for the fighter to close. Aim carefully. Fire in short bursts. Conserve ammunition. The training instructors at gunnery school had drilled it into every student. Ammunition was limited. Accuracy mattered more than volume. A disciplined gunner could make 800 rounds last an entire mission. The doctrine assumed the enemy would cooperate. The Luftwaffe did not. German pilots had studied American tactics. They knew the gunners waited until 300 yards, so they opened fire at 600 yards, pouring cannon shells into the bomber formations while the Americans held their triggers. By the time the tail gunners started shooting, the damage was already done. Arooth had calculated the problem differently. A Focke-Wulf 190 at 600 yards was not a difficult target. It was flying straight toward him, nose pointed directly at his position, presenting the largest possible profile. The closure rate meant the apparent size doubled every few seconds. A gunner who started firing early could walk his tracers onto the target, adjusting aim as the range decreased. The risk was ammunition. 800 rounds sounded like a lot, until you divided it by the number of attacking fighters. A mission might see 15, 20, even 30 separate attacks. At 50 rounds per burst, the mathematics turned brutal. A gunner who fired early might run dry before the mission ended. Arooth accepted the trade-off. A gunner who conserved ammunition but died on the third attack had made a poor bargain. Survival required disrupting the enemy's attack before it succeeded. If that meant running low on bullets, he would deal with that problem later. Dead men had no use for reserve ammunition. His first test came on his fourth mission, a raid against submarine pens at St. Nazaire in June. A pair of Bf 109 seconds approached from the 6 o'clock low position. The classic tail attack. Standard doctrine said, wait. Arooth opened fire at 700 yards. The traces arced across the sky, falling short at first, then climbing toward the lead fighter. The German pilot saw the fire coming and broke off his attack, diving away before reaching effective cannon range. His wingman followed. Neither fighter scored a hit on Tondelayo. The crew chief questioned Arooth after landing. The ammunition count showed he had expended nearly 200 rounds on a single engagement. At that rate, he would run out before reaching targets deep inside Germany. Arooth explained his reasoning. The crew chief remained skeptical. Other tail gunners heard about the incident. Some called it reckless. Wasting ammunition on long-range shots violated everything the Army Air Force taught. The training manuals existed for reasons. Arooth was gambling with his crew's lives. But Tondelayo kept coming home. Mission after mission. The bomber returned to Kimballton with its crew intact. Other aircraft in the 527th Squadron were not so fortunate. By mid-July, 3 bombers from the squadron had gone down, 30 men lost. Now, crossing into Belgium on July 30th, Arooth watched the P-47 escorts waggle their wings and turn back toward England. The fuel gauges in the Thunderbolts demanded retreat. The bombers pressed on alone. Somewhere ahead, 300 German fighters were waiting. Arooth would need every round he had. He would also need to survive long enough to use them. The first Messerschmitts appeared at 11:42, climbing from the southeast in groups of 4. Arooth counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting. The sky behind Tondelayo filled with black crosses on yellow noses. The lead fighter began its attack run from the 6 o'clock high position, diving toward the bomber formation at 400 miles per hour. Arooth tracked the aircraft through his gun sight, watching the wingspan grow larger with each passing second. At 800 yards, he squeezed both triggers. The twin Brownings roared to life, sending a stream of traces across the sky. The first rounds fell short, disappearing into empty air below the diving fighter. Arooth adjusted, walking the fire upward. At 600 yards, the traces began connecting. Bright flashes sparked along the Messerschmitt's engine, cowling. The German pilot broke hard right, smoke trailing from his aircraft. He never completed his firing pass. The fighter spiraled downward, disappearing into the cloud layer below. Arooth had no time to watch. The second attacker was already closing. This one came in lower, trying to slip beneath Arooth's field of fire. The angle was difficult, requiring him to depress his guns nearly to their mechanical limit. He fired anyway, sending a long burst toward the approaching fighter. The Focke-Wulf pilot flinched, pulling up early and releasing his cannon shells into empty sky above Tondelayo. The attacks continued for 47 minutes. Wave after wave of German fighters slashed through the bomber formation, targeting stragglers and damaged aircraft. Arooth fired at everything that came within range, burning through ammunition at 3 times the recommended rate. His gun barrels glowed red from sustained fire. At 12:29, a Bf-109 approached from directly astern, flying straight and level. The pilot had either extraordinary courage or poor judgment. Arooth centered the fighter in his gun sight and held the triggers down. The Brownings hammered for 6 continuous seconds, pouring over 100 rounds into the approaching aircraft. The Messerschmitt disintegrated. The engine separated from the fuselage. The wings folded backward. What remained of the fighter tumbled past Tondelayo, close enough for Arooth to see the empty cockpit. The pilot had either ejected or died at the controls. 2 confirmed kills. Ammunition down to 180 rounds. The formation reached Kassel at 12:51 and began its bombing run. For 11 minutes, the bombers flew straight and level, unable to maneuver while the bombardiers lined up their targets. The Luftwaffe knew this moment represented maximum vulnerability. The fighters pressed their attacks with renewed fury. A Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tondelayo from the 5 o'clock position. Arooth swung his guns to meet it, firing a short burst. The rounds struck the fighter's wing root. The pilot kept coming, cannon shells tearing through Tondelayo's tail section. Arooth felt the impacts before he felt the pain. 20-millimeter fragments ripped through the plexiglass, shredding his flight suit and burying themselves in his left arm and shoulder. His left gun jammed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the compartment. He kept firing with the right gun, one-handed, bleeding. He tracked the wounded Focke-Wulf as it pulled away. A final burst caught the fighter's tail assembly. The aircraft snap rolled and dove toward the ground. His 3rd kill of the mission. The intercom crackled with voices from the crew. Someone was asking about damage. Someone else reported flak ahead. Arooth tried to respond, but his throat had gone dry. Blood pooled on the floor of his compartment, freezing almost instantly in the sub-zero air. 400 rounds expended, 63 remaining, 3 German fighters destroyed. And the mission was only half over. Tondelayo still had to fly 250 miles back to England through the same gauntlet of fighters that had nearly killed him on the way in. Arooth wrapped a scarf around his wounded arm and waited for the next attack. The return flight began at 13:04. Tondelayo turned westward with 185 other bombers, leaving Kassel burning beneath a column of black smoke. Arooth remained at his position, scanning the sky through blood-smeared plexiglass. The Luftwaffe was not finished. German fighters regrouped over Belgium, positioning themselves along the bomber stream's route to the English Channel. Fresh aircraft replaced those lost or damaged in the morning attacks. The second gauntlet would be as dangerous as the first. Arooth's left arm had gone numb from the cold and the wounds. His jammed gun remained inoperable, the feed mechanism shattered by the same cannon shell that had injured him. He had one functioning weapon and 63 rounds of ammunition to cover 250 miles of hostile airspace. The mathematics demanded a different approach. At 63 rounds, he could afford perhaps 3 engagements of 20 rounds each. Every trigger pull had to count. The luxury of suppressive fire was gone. At 13:31, a pair of BF 109 seconds closed from the 7 o'clock position. Arooth waited until 500 yards, then fired a precise 12-round burst at the lead fighter. The tracers struck the engine cowling. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away, trailing glycol coolant. The wingman broke off without attacking. 51 rounds remaining. Tondelayo crossed into France at 14:15. The fighter attacks diminished as the Luftwaffe reached the limit of their operational range. By 14:47, the bomber formation had outrun the last German interceptors. The English Channel appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later. The landing at Kimballton came at 15:52. Arooth could not climb out of his compartment without assistance. Ground crew pulled him through the narrow hatch and carried him to a waiting ambulance. The flight surgeon counted 11 separate fragment wounds in his arm, shoulder, and upper back. Word spread through the 379th Bombardment Group. Within hours, the tail gunner on Tondelayo had scored 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables while wounded, operating a single gun with 63 rounds of ammunition. The Mission Intelligence Report noted his early engagement technique as a contributing factor to the bomber's survival. Other tail gunners began asking questions. The standard doctrine said, "Wait until 300 yards." Arooth had opened fire at 800. The doctrine said conserve ammunition. Arooth had burned through 700 rounds before getting hit. The doctrine produced dead gunners. Arooth was still alive. The 527th Squadron's gunnery officer reviewed the combat footage from Tondelayo's mission. The gun camera showed Arooth's tracers reaching out far beyond normal engagement range, disrupting attack runs before the German pilots could establish firing solutions. The early fire forced the enemy to maneuver, degrading their accuracy and reducing hits on the bomber. By mid-August, 3 other tail gunners in the squadron had adopted variations of Arooth's technique. Their survival rates improved. The bombers they protected returned with less damage. The correlation was difficult to ignore. The 379th Group commander received a preliminary report on September 1st. The data suggested that aggressive early fire reduced bomber casualties by disrupting coordinated fighter attacks. The implications challenged 2 years of established gunnery doctrine. Meanwhile, Arooth recovered from his wounds at the station hospital. The fragment damage had missed major blood vessels and nerves. The flight surgeon cleared him for duty on August 19th, 3 weeks after the Kassel mission. Tondelayo had a new aircraft waiting. The old bomber had been written off after accumulating too much battle damage for economical repair. The replacement carried the same name and the same crew. Arooth climbed back into the tail position on August 26th. The Luftwaffe had noticed something changing in the American bomber formations. Their intelligence officers were studying the problem. Luftwaffe intelligence officers noticed the pattern in early September. American tail gunners were opening fire earlier, sometimes at ranges exceeding 600 yards. The change disrupted attack formations that had worked reliably for months. German fighter pilots reported the shift in debriefings across occupied Europe. The approach from 6 o'clock, once the safest angle against B-17 formations, was becoming increasingly dangerous. Traces reached out before pilots could establish stable firing platforms. The psychological effect was significant. A pilot watching traces stream toward his aircraft at long range instinctively maneuvered even when the rounds were falling short. The Luftwaffe's tactical response came in 3 phases. First, they increased approach speeds, diving on bomber formations at maximum velocity to reduce exposure time. Second, they shifted attack angles, approaching from the high 6 o'clock position where gravity would assist their pull-out. Third, they began targeting specific aircraft that appeared to have aggressive gunners, hoping to eliminate the threat before it could spread. None of these adaptations solved the fundamental problem. Faster approaches meant less accurate shooting. Steeper angles increased the difficulty of tracking targets through the dive. Targeting aggressive gunners required identifying them in advance, which was nearly impossible in the chaos of a running air battle. The 379th Bombardment Group flew 11 missions between August 26th and September 5th. Arooth participated in 4 of them, adding 2 more confirmed kills to his record. Other tail gunners in the group claimed an additional 7. The Luftwaffe's loss ratio against the Triangle K bombers was climbing. German fighter commanders tried concentrating their attacks. Instead of spreading interceptors across the entire bomber stream, they massed against single groups, hoping to overwhelm defensive fire through sheer numbers. The tactic produced results on September 3rd when concentrated attacks against the 100th Bombardment Group destroyed 8 aircraft in 15 minutes. The 379th escaped that slaughter by flying in a different position within the combat box, but the lesson was clear. The Luftwaffe was adapting, searching for weaknesses in the new defensive approach. The air war over Europe had become a contest of tactical innovation, with each side studying the other's methods and developing countermeasures. Arooth understood the stakes. His technique worked because it surprised the enemy. Once the Germans developed effective responses, the advantage would disappear. Every mission was a test, every engagement a data point that both sides would analyze. The temporary edge that aggressive fire provided was eroding with each passing week. The mission scheduled for September 6th would target Stuttgart deep in southern Germany. The route would carry the bombers over 500 miles of enemy territory, the longest penetration the 8th Air Force had attempted that month. Intelligence predicted heavy fighter opposition from bases in France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Stuttgart manufactured ball bearings, components essential to every vehicle, aircraft, and weapon in the German arsenal. The strategic importance made it one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Flak batteries ringed the city. Fighter squadrons were positioned along every likely approach route. The briefing on September 5th laid out the challenge. The 379th would fly in the lead position of the combat wing, responsible for navigation and bomb, aiming for the formations following behind. Lead position meant absorbing the first fighter attacks. It meant flying straight and level while other groups maneuvered. It meant maximum exposure to everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. Arooth checked his guns that evening. Both Brownings were freshly serviced, the feed mechanism smooth, the barrels replaced after accumulating too many rounds. He loaded 1,200 rounds instead of the standard 800. The extra ammunition added weight, but weight seemed less important than firepower. Tomorrow would test everything he had learned. Tomorrow would determine whether his methods could survive the most dangerous mission of his career. The Stuttgart mission launched at 0540 on September 6th. 187 bombers climbed into an overcast English sky, forming up over the North Sea, before turning southeast toward occupied Europe. Tondelayo flew in the lead element of the 379th formation, positioned where Arooth would face the first attacks from any direction. The fighters found them over France at 09:15. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose from airfields across the region, climbing to intercept the bomber stream before it reached German airspace. The initial attacks came from the 11 o'clock position, head-on passes that tested the nose gunners rather than the tail. Arooth waited, watching contrails multiply behind the formation. The Luftwaffe was building strength, assembling fighters from multiple units into a concentrated force. By 0940, intelligence estimates counted over 100 interceptors tracking the bombers. The rear attacks began at 10:08. A staffel of 12 Bf 109 seconds positioned themselves 2,000 feet below the formation, then pulled up in a climbing attack from the 6 o'clock low. Arooth opened fire at 700 yards, sending traces into the lead element. 2 fighters broke off immediately. A third absorbed multiple hits and fell away smoking. The remaining 9 pressed their attack. Cannon shells ripped through the formation, striking bombers throughout the 379th Combat Box. The B-17 flying off Tondelayo's left wing took hits to its No. 3 engine. Another bomber in the low squadron began trailing fuel from ruptured tanks. Arooth kept firing, shifting from target to target as fighters flashed through his field of view. His ammunition counter dropped steadily. 600 rounds, 500, 400. The attacks showed no sign of diminishing. At 10:31, a Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tondelayo from directly above and behind, using the sun to mask its approach. Arooth spotted the fighter too late. 20mm shells punched through the tail section before he could bring his guns to bear. The impacts threw him against the plexiglass. His left gun was destroyed, the receiver shattered by a direct hit. Fragments tore through his flight suit, opening wounds across his arms and scalp. Blood poured down his face, partially blinding him. He kept firing with the right gun. The Focke-Wulf pulled up and rolled away, trailing smoke from hits scored during its dive. Arooth wiped blood from his eyes and searched for the next attacker. Tondelayo was dying. The fighter's cannon fire had severed hydraulic lines, damaged the tail controls, and punctured fuel tanks in the wing roots. The pilots fought to maintain altitude, but the bomber was losing the battle against gravity and aerodynamics. The formation reached Stuttgart at 11:04. Tondelayo held position long enough to release its bombs over the target, then fell out of formation as the damage overwhelmed the crew's ability to compensate. 2 engines were running rough. The fuel situation was critical. The pilots made the decision over eastern France. Tondelayo could not reach England. The best option was a controlled ditching in the English Channel, where air rescue units might reach them before hypothermia set in. Arooth remained at his position as the bomber descended, watching for fighters that might pursue the crippled aircraft. None came. The Luftwaffe had other targets, healthier bombers still flying in formation. Tondelayo hit the channel at 15:12, impacting the grey water at 120 miles per hour. The fuselage broke apart on impact. Arooth was thrown forward, his head striking the gun mount. Darkness. When he regained consciousness, he was floating in a life raft. British rescue boats were approaching. All 10 crew members had survived the ditching. The bomber that had carried them through 17 missions lay at the bottom of the English Channel. The 379th Commander was already requesting Arooth's mission reports. The Distinguished Service Cross citation arrived on October 14, 1943. The second highest military decoration the United States Army could award recognized Arooth's actions during the Kassel and Stuttgart missions. The citation specifically mentioned his decision to continue firing while wounded, crediting his defensive fire with protecting the bomber during its most vulnerable moments. The 8th Air Force's gunnery staff had completed their analysis by late October. The data covered 14 bomber groups across 3 months of operations. The conclusions challenged assumptions that had governed American air combat since 1942. Tail gunners who engaged targets beyond 500 yards showed measurably higher survival rates than those who followed standard doctrine. The early fire disrupted enemy formations, forcing German pilots to maneuver defensively rather than establishing stable firing platforms. The ammunition cost was significant, but the trade-off favored the aggressive approach. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, commander of 8th Bomber Command's operational planning, reviewed the findings personally. The implications extended beyond individual aircraft. If coordinated early fire from multiple bombers could disrupt mass fighter attacks, the entire defensive doctrine might require revision. The formal policy change came in November. New gunnery guidelines authorized tail gunners to engage targets at extended ranges when tactical conditions permitted. The bureaucratic language was cautious, but the meaning was clear. The approach that had kept Arooth alive was becoming official doctrine. Arooth never saw the policy take full effect. His head injuries from the Stuttgart ditching proved more serious than initial assessments indicated. After returning to flight status in late September, he completed 3 additional missions before medical officers grounded him permanently. Recurring headaches and vision problems made continued combat duty impossible. His final tally stood at 17 confirmed kills, with 4 additional probables awaiting verification. The number placed him among the highest-scoring bomber gunners in the 8th Air Force. Some records credited him with as many as 19 victories, though documentation inconsistencies made precise counts difficult. The Distinguished Flying Cross followed the Distinguished Service Cross. 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters recognized his cumulative combat achievements. The Purple Heart acknowledged his wounds. By the time his combat career ended, Arooth had accumulated more decorations than most pilots. The 379th Bombardment Group continued operations for another 18 months, flying through the winter of 1943, the invasion, summer of 1944, and the final campaigns of 1945. The tactics Arooth had pioneered spread throughout 8th Bomber Command. Tail gunners across the 8th Air Force adopted variations of early engagement doctrine. The statistical impact emerged gradually. Bomber loss rates declined through 1944, though multiple factors contributed. Longer-range fighter escorts reduced exposure to unprotected combat. Improved aircraft systems enhanced survivability. But defensive gunnery also played a role, and the shift toward aggressive fire was part of that improvement. German fighter pilots noticed the change. Interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe aircrew mentioned the increased danger of tail attacks against American formations. The easy kills that had characterized early bomber interceptions became progressively harder to achieve. Some pilots shifted entirely to head-on attacks, accepting the higher closure rates in exchange for avoiding concentrated rear hemisphere fire. Arooth shipped home to the United States in early 1944. The Army Air Forces assigned him to training duties, passing his combat experience to new gunners preparing for deployment overseas. He spent the remainder of the war teaching others the techniques that had kept him alive. The students who passed through his courses carried his methods into combat over Germany, over Japan, over every theater where American bombers faced enemy fighters. What he did after the war surprised everyone who knew him. Michael Arooth did not leave military service after the war ended. He transferred to the newly formed United States Air Force in 1947 and continued serving for another 15 years. The man who had survived the deadliest skies over Europe chose to remain in uniform until 1962, retiring at the rank of Master Sergeant. The decision puzzled some who knew his history. Arooth had accumulated enough combat experience for several lifetimes. He had been wounded twice, ditched in the English Channel, and faced death more times than official records could capture. Most veterans with similar experiences wanted nothing more than civilian life. Arooth saw it differently. The Air Force had given him purpose during the darkest years of the century. The skills he developed had saved lives, not just his own, but the crews who flew with him and the gunners who learned from his methods. Walking away felt like abandoning something important. His post-war years were quiet. He married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about his combat experiences. The medals stayed in a drawer. The memories stayed locked away. Like many veterans of his generation, Arooth believed that those who had not been there could never truly understand. Elmer Bendiner, Tondelayo's navigator, took a different path. He became a journalist and author, eventually writing a memoir titled The Fall of Fortresses. The book described the crew's experiences in detail, preserving moments that might otherwise have been lost to history. Bendiner's account ensured that Tondelayo and her crew would not be forgotten. The 379th Bombardment Group held reunions for decades after the war. Veterans gathered to remember friends who had not returned, to share stories that their families had never heard, to honor the young men they had once been. Arooth attended when his health permitted, reconnecting with survivors from those desperate months over Europe. The National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona received his remains on February 20th, 1990. He had died 5 days earlier in St. Augustine, Florida, at the age of 70. The headstone listed his rank, his service branch, and his war. It did not mention the 17 fighters he had destroyed, or the crews he had protected, or the doctrine he had helped reshape. Military cemeteries are full of such understatements. The stones mark names and dates, but cannot capture the weight of what those names represent. Arooth lies among thousands of other veterans, each with stories that deserve telling. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia, preserves the history of the bomber crews who flew from England. The 379th Bombardment Group's records are archived there, including mission reports that document Arooth's combat achievements. Researchers can trace the evolution of gunnery doctrine through documents that bear his influence. The B-17 tail gunner position no longer exists. The aircraft that carried men like Arooth into combat have mostly vanished, reduced to museum pieces and memorial displays. But the principles he demonstrated, the value of aggressive action over passive defense, the willingness to challenge doctrine that was getting men killed, those principles endure. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about tail gunners who protected their crews with courage and innovation. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Michael Arooth does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.